Okay, well, welcome back to the colloquium and perhaps the most popular element of these colloquia, which is the panel session composed of our speakers. We'll now entertain your questions and on this important subject. So you can still submit your questions using the online processes that we've used before, either Q&A or chat. The moderator for the panel session is Dr. Anthony Vinci. I remind you that Dr. Vinci was the keynote speaker for our first RIA colloquium, and he will be back to moderate the panel session for the third colloquium in August. He is with the Center for New American Security and recently retired from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. He continues to be an inspiration and a source of ideas for planning this series of talks. Over to you, Anthony.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. I found it to be an extremely fascinating discussion and a great follow-up to the first session that we had. We've really started to get into some of the details of what an RIA would look like, what some of the particular issues might be, and in the last talk by Jason, what some of our adversaries out there are doing in their own RIAs, which was for me pretty concerning to hear about. So really fascinating so far, and we've gotten several good questions in that. Many of the questions have already been answered, but there are a few we haven't addressed, and I have a few that are directed at all of the panelists. And I would just like to say to anyone else who's listening in, if you have additional questions, please just put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and I'll be happy to get to those as well. So with that, what I thought I would do is start out with a question from Dan Flynn, from the Office of Intelligence Net Assessment. And Dan says, our speakers today did an excellent job in identifying the wide range of challenges and opportunities resulting from the revolution in intelligence affairs. What are the priority actions they would recommend to the D&I that the IC needs to take to better prepare for the future intelligence environment? So it's directed at all the panelists. So I thought what we could do is go in order of speakers from earlier today. So Jack, if it's all right with you, if you're still listening in, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. I'll keep it pretty short since I'm always a little reluctant to jump in on IC recommendations as primarily a member of the Department of Defense. However, based on what I said this morning, I think it's really an internal look at, first and foremost, culture. Is the culture the right culture to be able to make the advances that all of us talked about, up to and including Jason at the end there, really talking about big ideas about the future? I think those are going to revolve around cultural changes and ideas of diversity and training people differently. And then there's always an organizational piece. And here's where you sort of split things a little bit, why people are reluctant to make big organizational changes. We've all been on the whip end of that, where somebody comes in as new leader, say we're going to shake up the organization. In this case, I don't see how you cannot change organization structural parts, fundamental structure of the organization across the IC over the next few years. How that exactly is done, I'll leave it to others to talk about. But I think if you use Jason's framework as a starting point, it's going to be a different looking IC than it is right now and than it was 15, 20 years ago. Anthony, you remember very well that Robert got himself in a little bit of a hot water at the NGA by talking about how the analysts in that organization could start doing multi-int based on all the different sources of intelligence they had access to. And others said, well, that's not the role of NGA, that's DIA's role or somebody else's. I think he was skating to where the puck was going to be because he saw it coming. And the idea of so many analysts across all different intel organizations will have access to so much more different intelligence and information should we be looking differently at how you bring those sources of information and intelligence together, where it's no longer a single source? There's a balance. There's a balance with deep expertise in, say, geospatial intelligence, and getting too thin by going out and touching other sources. So I would say culture, first of all, and culture drives organizational questions and thoughts. And then I'm always going to turn to diversity. Diversity and experience, diversity and background is going to make us a better, more effective IC for the next decade. So I'll stop there and let the others jump in.
I think that's the right place to start, is with culture. And anyone who's tried to do any sort of change management knows that's the most difficult part of it all. And what's even harder within the IC is that there's multiple cultures, and each different agency has its own, and some are more forward leaning than others. And then, obviously within the agencies, they have their own separate cultures depending on what part you're in, if you're on the ops side or the analyst side, for example. Though I will disagree with you, Robert never got himself into any hot water, nor did I, in any way, in anything that we were doing there. Everything we tried to do to transform that agency was accepted wholeheartedly by all individuals across the agency. So just to put that on the record. Davey, would you like to go?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Anthony. And I completely agree with General Shanahan when it comes to culture, and importantly, how to attract and retain the type of talent who can actually make these shifts possible. As people want to make change, as they want to engage with the new technology in new ways, instead of forcing those people, out back into the private sector, actually bringing those people in and then retaining and cultivating that talent from within, which I believe also has to do with a lot of upskilling and empowering those individuals as professionals to make that shift. Now, those are kind of some very large foundational changes. And I'll take kind of the opposite approach, or the opposite side, which is what is something tactical to do. Now, from the talk, one of the subjects I brought up was this need for kind of OSINT red teaming. Now, I think that's an area that I would like to see greatly expanded as a small tactical first step, solely because as you start to do it, all of these other gaps are going to start being realized. You're going to start seeing data pipes and the inability to purchase this data, acquire this data, the inability to store it, to fuse it, to synthesize it, and to finally analyze it and use it in operational domain. So by starting to actually interrogate it from our own perspective, looking in, we can develop a culture of excellence, a center of excellence type model, and to start shifting the mindset to actually using this as part of ongoing operational environments. So that's where I would like to see us to start to take that small step. I'll leave it to the folks more senior to think more kind of widespread and holistic on how do we actually change the culture of the entire IC with the DoD. But to start there, I think will give us at least some forward momentum while we make these larger and absolutely requisite changes to how we do business within the IC.
Yeah, Davey, let me pile on with you. And even the concept of open source being something that is about information shows how far we are away from the real world, where open source we should think about it as data and information, right? And these are two different things. And a lot of the collection and just the history of that area is about reading newspapers from foreign countries and things like that, and up through today and the internet. But when you talk about data, it could be data from anything. Mm-hmm. And we heard in the first panel about gray information, which is, open source in the sense that it's not classified, it's not from a government agency, but it's, proprietary or otherwise inaccessible, and it gets very blurry. But I love your concept of the red teaming on it.
Thank you,
Duyane.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. I love this question. I think it's a great question. Jack this morning outlined, I think it was 6 different kind of things that are necessary for change. I agree with all of them, but I think there's one that stands above all the others, and that is this idea of leaders with the who provide the top cover and provide resources. I think all of the others that Jack outlined are dependent completely and wholly on whether or not there are leaders there who will defend them and enable them. with all the others, you could have all 5 of the others, and without the leaders, it doesn't matter. And we did a lot of studies in the agency and a lot of talk about this idea of a organizational stampede. Like, could you build enough energy from the middle or from below to force change? And I think the answer to that, candidly, at least in my opinion, is no. I think without visionary leadership, you just don't see that kind of change. And I think if you look in the private sector at any of the great disruptive companies over the past 20 or 30 years, they all have some form of visionary leadership. Lots of different types of visionary leaders. Elon Musk is very different from Bill Gates, is very different from Steve Jobs. But you have visionary leaders who have a vision and are able to rally people behind them to support that vision. You have visionary leaders who simply understand the need for change, and they build a leadership team and a culture that promotes that kind of change within. But in every case, you have visionary leaders. The other piece that you have in the private sector for all of these companies is stability at leadership. If for you to bring about the kind of change you need, you oftentimes have to outlive. If you can't fire them, you need that kind of iron middle that doesn't want to change. Then you have to outlast them. And in a culture where we move and change jobs every 2 to 3 years, whether you're in the IC or DoD, it really makes it very difficult for the few times when you have those visionary leaders get into a position where they have power. The folks around them who want to resist the change just simply outlast them and wait it out. So I think finding a way to have visionary leaders and keep them in power and promoting that enables the rest of it. I agree with everything Jack said, but I think you need those visionary leaders. The last comment that I will make is the other commonality oftentimes in the private sector for these visionary leaders is almost all of them have at least one, some of them multiple stories of pretty significant failure. I mean, in some cases, really bad bankruptcy type failures, right? They failed before they got it right. And that's what helps them oftentimes get it right and have a higher tolerance for failure and pain. If you look at government and you look at most of the senior ranks, very few had significant failures during their career, because within our career services, oftentimes a significant failure can be a career killer. Now, that's not universal across the board, but there is a tendency within government, in my opinion, to promote kind of the steady eddies, right? The people who do a good job of doing a 5% or 10% by metrics better job than their predecessor. And they kind of steadily move through the ranks as being, perfectly good managers of people. That's very different than this idea of disruptive or visionary, transformation agents. And I really think that you need that leadership level. If the leaders aren't disruptors themselves, they need to at least value, support, and enable the disruptors.
Dwayne, to challenge you one more step, what is the right level for those visionary leaders? Does it have to be the agency directors or the D&I?
Yeah,
or is it somewhere in the middle?
So it depends on how you define visionary. And I tried to distinguish early on. I don't think you have to have leaders who have the vision for how to bring about the change. In fact, in many cases, I think it's wrong. The model that I would do is like the Jeff Bezos model, right? Bezos had one really good idea, or an online bookstore, but Amazon is so much beyond that now. But if you look at what Amazon evolved and grew into, very little of that was Bezos's ideas. It was he put the people around him and brought people in with good ideas and then built a culture and enabled the changes that enabled Amazon to become what it is today. Jack had a fantastic example when he talked about bringing in his tech director from outside industry. Like, you don't need to recognize that you don't need to have the answers as a leader, but you need to create an environment where you bring in the right talent that does it. I mean, I think Davey's right too. I mean, I think cross-discipline teams, the tactical has to pair with the strategic, and the strategic is driven by the leaders. I don't care how visionary you are, you can be an SIS-4 pretty senior, hundreds of millions of dollars of budget. You can have all kinds of responsibility, but if you've got a director, a deputy director, a couple people above you who are resistant to the kind of change that you want to implement and believe in, it stops right there. It just stops. It dies. So without that high level buy-in, I think I think we are stuck with incremental change. And all of us today, the one common theme is the need for transformative change, not incremental change.
Yeah, makes sense. Todd?
Yeah, I'm going to stick to what I know and talk about the legal change. My fellow panelists know much more about the ins and outs than I do, but I think that we need to start looking at data as a strategic asset. And to do that, we can't wait for the courts to rule case by case in which the IC and the government is just going to be reactionary in trying to deal with that. We need the IC to approach Congress and get Congress interested in actually setting forth a set of data protection laws, guidelines for accessing that data for intelligence purposes in an oversight regime that takes into account the modern information environment. That's what I think, from the legal side we need.
It's almost parallel to when you hear some of the social media companies saying, come in and regulate me so that I can get about my business, because otherwise I'm guilty of everything, no matter what. And it's almost like the IC is kind of in a similar position.
Definitely.
Jason?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on this. I think that the national intelligence strategy needs a relook. If you go through that, the most current iteration of the document, you'll find nary mention of science, technology, intelligence as a priority, and I think that needs to get a bit more attention in the strategy itself. Along with that, I think that the time has come for a proper open source intelligence agency, and there's a lot of reasons why I think that is now necessary. One of them is because of the ability of the opposition to poison information. We need to have professionals within the community that are able to look at open source information and evaluate it and exploit it. So I think the time has come for that. But really the bigger reason is that I think the greatest benefit from collected information in the future is actually going to come not from classified. It's going to come from open source. That's my view. And then the last thing that I would mention, but certainly not least important, is the need to restore some critical relationships between the government and the industrial base that supports it. We really don't have the kind of partnership that we enjoyed during the buildup and at the peak of the Cold War, the US-Soviet Cold War. Globalization has changed the dynamic a little bit, and I think that needs to be restored. I would go further to say that also the consumer-producer relationship with respect to intelligence needs to be enhanced as well. The suggestion that there's a diminished demand signal for science and technology intelligence or open source intelligence, to me, is hard to fathom. And that suggests that there's room for improvement with that consumer-producer relationship.
Jason, just hooking back into your talk, how do you think, can you channel for a second, how do you think that the answers to Dan's questions would be given by this same panel in China, by their head of their version of the Jake, or all of your positions?
Well, I think that the opposition, both the Chinese and the Russians, find themselves in a rather desperate position, but not only in terms of where they've been up until very recently with intelligence capability and potential, but but also a sense of desperation for either maintaining their current position or changing that position in the 21st century. In the case of the Russians, it's about maintaining and potentially gaining in some areas. In the case of the Chinese, it's a very dramatic set of objectives that they're trying to achieve, and there's a real sense of urgency behind them. So what I see is, in the best case, we have a whole of government approach in the United States, and that's the best of cases. In these other two contexts, I think they have a whole of nation approach to this problem, and they have the ability to marshal the fullest potential of the nation and what it brings. That's a greater challenge for us, and I think it's something we need to think carefully about and get after.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to dive into some more questions. This is from Julia Mossbridge, and I'm going to ask this one to Jack, but Duyane, I have a follow-up for you coming out of it. And she asks, as analysts offload more analysis to AI helpers, it seems to me developing intuition among analysts, a skill that is not yet possessed by AI, becomes more important. Do you agree? And if so, what plans can be put in place to support intuitive thinking in analysts? And Jack, I would add to that question, is it the job of people such as yourself in your old role to focus on that as well, who are charged with developing the AI systems or managing the programs or trying to get them implemented? Is that where that question should be answered?
Yeah, so I like the question. I'm going to offer a little bit of a caution here in that sometimes intuition can be incredibly helpful up to a certain point, at which case it could be disastrously wrong. And I think it's most wrong in senior leaders who have relied on so-called gut instinct and intuition for 30, 35 years and decide that they know the answer to a particular problem, and it turns out to be 180 degrees different, and we get ourselves into a war. So I think intuition has to be approached with somewhat cautiously on this. Now, instinct in developing an analyst tradecraft, I would take that as really the main question here, which is the right question. AI does not have that. I'm not sure. Back to the question this morning where somebody asked about what did I mean by AI common sense, and that was in laser quotes from Gilman Louis. I think he meant it a little bit differently than I probably said it. But the idea of, can a human and machine work together so that over time that machine starts to reflect what that analyst really wants to concentrate on, which is a reflection of that analyst's intuition and tradecraft and experience then built into the machine itself. And I think just like the chess example or the Go example, machine and human working together will get better and better over time. I think that's the case here too. Now, how good can it get? I don't know yet. The reason we were such a strong supporter of putting MVP out in the field as quickly as possible is to let the operators tear it apart, let the Intel analysts tear it apart. And what they wanted was generally different than what we gave them on iteration one. So that was a reflection of, hey, we like kind of what this is doing, but can it do this? Can it do this? Well, we didn't think about that. So I think that's what we're really talking about here. You're always going to want to develop the analyst intuition by experience. By the more they understand, the deeper they understand a particular region or country or a science and technology aspect of it, the better they'll get at understanding sort of the context behind the big issues in play. But by sitting there and helping train a machine, I think you're going to end up with the best of both worlds. I don't want to see a world in which you throw out experience, intuition, and instinct because the machine will take care of it. That's really bad. And that's when analysts will say, no, the machine said this, I trust the machine. I wouldn't necessarily trust the machine. I would trust the machine for certain basic things like counting numbers or telling me certain things. It will get better at context over time. It will take a long time to get there. So I like the question. I would just put it a little bit differently in terms of intuition and instinct.
And do you think it's the job of organizations like the JAIC to worry about and solve for that? Clearly, they've taken on that AI ethics as part of that job. Does it also go into the human side this far?
Well, so here's how to answer that question, Anthony. I think there's a responsibility for places like the JAG to set some sort of overarching framework. Let's say responsible AI. That in general, AI needs to meet these principles. Now, down at each organization, agency level, now you're starting to talk about individual training and experience. So I think that's where the real work gets done, but you need a framework for above it. I don't think for a second that JAG can be teaching all the things that an Intel analyst should know about she or he should know about anything that's germane to their daily job, but it is to set a framework, because if you don't have that framework, well, now you're sort of coming up with all different options.
Yep. Duyane, I kind of want to, just to compare and contrast, ask you kind of the same question, except from the ops perspective, because case officers and people on the ops side, intuition and those very human traits are equally as important. But I think the implication here is that AI isn't just going to be limited to analysis. It's going to affect all sorts of parts of it. And you brought up even that things like cover go away, that changes, or that you need whole teams of people. You're not, having only one or two people do it. What do you think? How does AI affect the ops side?
Yeah, so we have a parallel that closely aligns with analysts when you talk about targeters on the ops side, right? I mean, it's just a different side of the same coin, but really you're talking about humans making informed judgments, and that, whether you're doing it to analyze and develop finished intelligence products for policymakers, or you're compiling targeting packages for intelligence officers or military operators, you're still talking about making informed decisions, and that has become incredibly challenging today because there's so much information, and so there's really no way in many cases today for a human or even a team of humans to process all of the information that could inform that decision. So I think we've reached a point, because of the massive amounts of data, that you need some help from machines along the way to sort through and pay attention to what data you should be looking at. And so I think it's absolutely necessary to merge the two. I think the challenge is, rather than intuition, talk a little bit about the question of bias, right? I mean, the real challenge is when you have a human in the loop. Do they have a predetermined bias based on their own experience? Are they going to see something where it's not necessarily there? Are they not going to see something that's plainly there for something else? And I think that's where perhaps AI and ML can help a little bit to try to identify those biases and give flags and warnings to the analysts or targeters. Hey, the judgment you're making here might not be the best informed one. But yeah, given the massive amounts of data and given that human in the loop and that bias, I think that we absolutely can be better by leveraging new and emerging capabilities.
Yep. This is a question from Bruce Crawford, and he directs it to the panel, but Davey, I'm gonna redirect this at you and welcome anyone else from the panel to also answer it. And he asks, what do you think about a possible RIA by transitioning to government purchased real-time analysis services? And he said, with regard to space objects, for example, NASA is looking at space traffic management service suppliers, space situational awareness suppliers, conjunction assessment suppliers, and supplemental data suppliers, i.e. monitoring space weather threats. Perhaps there could be an IC equivalent of this for your own types of concerns.
Yeah, happy to, Anthony. I think that, Bruce, to answer that question and a kind of a few subsequent questions, not only around real-time analytics services, but also data acquisition, data normalization, as well as visualization, modeling and simulation, a whole host of related fields. We will have to lean on the commercial sector for these kind of government purchased services. The power balance between what we can produce internally versus what's available on the commercial side is oftentimes very heavily weighted towards the commercial sector. They are deploying significant resources into these domains. That said, I don't know if many of the problems for the IC are unique to the IC. There aren't a lot of commercial companies solving those exact same challenges. So many times what we do is we try to pick up a product that was developed in the private sector and simply graft it on to an intelligence problem. And that's becomes a challenge, not with all dual use technology, not with all dual use analytic, but with some aspects there does need to be not just a purchasing of these analytic capabilities, but also a real partnership that I don't always see in terms of the development of these capabilities. You see some success stories, but not in as many as I might want or would expect in many ways between co-creation, co-development, and design. There are some wins, especially on the DoD side within kind of the OTA and the SBIR community to do those co-development processes. I'm a huge proponent and advocate for these and think that the continuing to expand these capabilities into the IC in particular would be a huge benefit. To do that, you also have to do, small businesses, small innovative practices oftentimes lack the resources or lack the capability to get a facilities clearance, to hold and handle classified information, to really work with and understand these problem sets. So I do think there needs to be additional work at the the organizational level from the acquisition side in terms of not just the co-creation, but the ability to ease the burden, kind of the capital burden of small and innovative businesses working in particular with the IC, which is still and remains far more challenging for my own personal experience than working with the DoD with some of these more innovative contracting norms. So short answer, yes, I think that part of the RRA, part of this ongoing revolution is the need to harness this whole of nation approach, being able to really leverage and utilize the core capabilities inside of our private sector, as well as academic institutions. But I think that there's a lot of barriers that stand in the way between getting the best and the most innovative things and bringing them in-house as rapidly as the mission dictates. And that's where I think that we need to spend a lot more time.
Davey, let me take you one step further and compare the situation to what happened in warfare over the last 20 years, where there was a really significant shift in how the DoD and the government and really our society saw the role of people in the military versus contracting companies. And sort of significant portions of what we used to consider to be innately military functions, were effectively outsourced. Mm-hmm. There had always been contractors, but I would say it was a state change. It was just thinking completely differently about it. Everything from physical security to cooks to putting in IT, right? Kind of shifted over. Mm-hmm. For those people who were downrange in Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm sure that you saw that. And does a state change like that happen in the IC over the next 20 years? Or does it need to? Or would we want it to?
Yeah, there's a bunch to unpack in there. And I feel like I might disagree with myself in like 20 minutes after this conversation. On one hand, I worry that it will.
Answer. Yeah, that's a good place to start.
Yeah. I worry that there will be this shift, where the rise of kind of the modern mercenary or the rise of the modern kind of military downrange contractor, force protection all the way up to cooks, IT. But will that happen inside intelligence? I worry that it could. And it could for a variety of reasons, most likely said in a kind of a business context that ends up hurting us later on. That, hey, this is cheaper in the moment, or we don't need to support the level of kind of national, kind of a national service here. Let's offshore some of it, let the private sector eat those costs, therefore decreasing the, the line items to the citizen, to the taxpayer. But at the same time, that worries me to take anything kind of Title 50 related and offshore it to a private organization, to a private company. that's really beholden at the end of the day, primarily to shareholders. And while there's a lot of work within trusted capital going on, we still don't have a great way of knowing, who those shareholders ultimately are beholden to, but also it simply is not the power of the US people that they're beholden to. And so I think that there is a very real possibility without a conflict to drive into a race toward the bottom within the intelligence community to spend less and therefore offload more to the private sector. Now, when it's things like analytics or analytic engines or certain data collection, I'm comfortable with that. Now, I'm not comfortable when it comes to actually handling that data, especially as it pertains to potentially US citizens, that mix, as well as the targeting elements of how do you actually target and utilize that information in operational context. And then finally, within anything more related to case officers and kind of folks on the ground performing the human intelligence capabilities. So there are pieces of this that I'm very comfortable with. There are pieces of this that I'm not comfortable with at all. I do see without kind of either A, an actual conflict, or B, the acknowledgement that we are in a new type of kind of information warfare driven conflict on a go forward basis. Without that acknowledgement, I think the decreasing budgets and kind of shrinking overall pie could force us down that route. I'd love to know what the rest of the folks here think, though, as you all probably have a different set of viewpoints as well.
Me too. If anyone else has thoughts, we could have a whole conference on this, I'm sure. Okay, I'll let you off the hook. But Todd, I'm not going to let you off the hook. You wanted to stay in your comfort zone on legal issues, but I've got a hard one here for you from Sujit. And he asks, are ethics significant in AI applications in real war? I guess the country that does not subscribe to ethics will potentially win. I would broaden that question in two ways. Are ethics significant in intelligence and real war, given today's topic of the colloquium? And I'll give you a bit of an out and say, I would also be interested to hear the legal issues that you see addressing some of the topics you were talking about before when it's not performed by a human.
I'll I guess start with the ethics question. I think it's still important. Well, I guess I should go back. As a good lawyer, I'd have to preface it with "it depends" and ask you a question, right? What does to win mean? If winning is going to be killing every one of our adversaries, then perhaps the unethical may have an advantage. But if we are hoping to accomplish a peace at some point and stop using force, I think the ethics still plays a very large role. And I think you see this, the movement towards kind of reevaluating what it means to protect civilians, what civilian harm and conflicts really means. It used to be, you apply your distinction and proportionality analysis, and if your military advantage outweighs the number of civilians you're going to kill or civilian objects you're going to damage, that's lawful. And I think, what we're seeing is a move towards more than that, a move towards considering the more long-term and perhaps indirect effects, especially if we're going to talk about, cyber conflict, cyber attacks, because your collateral damage may be that one hard drive, those the ones and zeros on that server, but how is that going to affect the population? That depends on whether that's economic information, health information, data that helps run their energy sources. So I think ethics will help guide us as we develop that and kind of adapt to that wider, broader view of what civilian collateral damage is in armed conflict. And I also think it matters in intelligence, because I think both domestically and internationally, again, I'm not a case agent, never been a case agent, but I would have to think that, if a society or an organization that treats its sources and its agents ethically as much as possible have an advantage over those who, perhaps will just let them hang out to dry. And then I think domestically, our domestic audience, our domestic population, I think demands that we act ethically when we conduct intelligence activities. And again, if we lose that support, we probably lose not only the unethical activities that we've been engaged in, but some of the lawful and ethical activities that we really need to gather the information and the intel that we need. And the second one was, some of the issues that I had discussed before. Was the second part of the?
Yep. Oh, I was going to give you an out if you wanted to bring up the legal issues if it's an AI.
But
I think, opposed to a human doing it.
I think that's fascinating because, would we as a society somehow view an intrusion and a viewing and analyzing of data and information differently if it's done by a machine? Right. I think it goes to some of the issues we talked about biases and how do we correct for biases. Obviously the issue is, the fear is that you have somebody who's accessing very sensitive information for political purposes, for personal purposes, for something that's not official. So, could we perhaps alleviate that concern by using AI, machine learning, to conduct some of that analysis? I think, if nothing else, I think it offers the potential for vastly improving our oversight of intelligence activities, to again, perhaps catch some of those individuals who are doing things, that shouldn't be permitted or aren't permitted.
Yep. And on your point of collateral damage before, by the way, I think the line gets pretty blurry between intelligence and warfare when it comes to information releases. And if data is released about people in authoritarian regimes, they get to go to prison or get shot in courtyards, and it's not that different.
No, I mean, it doesn't take much of an imagination to think how unethical actors could use, deep fakes, falsified information, strategic leaks to, essentially target some of their adversaries or cause other people to target their adversaries in an unethical way.
Yep. This one is for Jason. It's from Don. It says, what can the U.S. learn from our adversaries regarding successful integration of OSINT into our decision cycles? And Jason, I'd go even further on this one. I mean, the sort of tide is turning here, where one of the things I took away from your talk in our previous discussions is the Chinese and the Russians learned from us, but in particular the Chinese in developing their IC. They're becoming very sophisticated. We may be in a position in the US where we now need to learn from them, and potentially from the Russians, although I suspect most of us on the panel don't want to be doing any sort of intelligence operations in similar ways to the Russians. But the big question for you is, what can we learn from what the Chinese and some of our adversaries are doing when it comes to OSINT and the use of technology in the IC and the RIA in general?
Anthony, thanks. It's a great question. And I think that the question about open source has a very obvious answer. Well, maybe not so obvious, but our adversaries place very, very heavy emphasis and weight on open source collection and exploitation and the production of professionally finished intelligence reports from that information. That's not what we do in the intelligence community. The intelligence community exploits secrets that are collected, and it produces finished intel based upon that reporting. Historically, in a free society, we've relied upon academia, a free press, and other institutions to gather open source information, perform research and analysis, and to deliver finished products of analysis on that. And so we haven't really had the same sort of prioritization. I think that the US intelligence community needs to start formalizing the production of OSINT, producing open source intelligence, finished intel, in the way that our adversaries do, because I think there is tremendous benefit to be derived from both the reports that would be produced, but also with that sense of priority, how it would stimulate open source collection. So I think there's a lot that we can do there. The good news story is that this is not expensive to do. It is not risky to do. And you don't have to have a clearance necessarily to do it. So there's a lot of analysts and researchers that could be enlisted to become involved in this in a lot of different ways. In other areas, I think there are also lessons from foreign experiences that should inform our activities, and particularly as we think about foresight, futuring, and that sort of thing. I think that historically we've really struggled to produce valued, anticipatory, predictive intelligence, and we haven't really allowed ourselves to even think about getting into the space of being prescriptive. You know, understanding the future with enough certainty or confidence that we can begin to build really sophisticated courses of action to optimally respond. That's a new area for us, and I'm hopeful that we will embrace that and pursue it. The technologies, the science that we have at our disposal to do that is there. It's no longer the kind of hobbling barrier that it once was, and so I think there's a real future in that space for us. And there's a lot of open source information in both Russian and Chinese that could give us insights about where they've been over the last 20 years, where it's worked, and where they're running into challenges that could inform our own efforts. Yeah, thanks. Great question.
Yeah, I agree with you on the prescriptive, and I think it's a profound thought. And I could see even a technical means of the IC going in that direction, like with modeling and simulation, as you talked about, and you and I have talked about in the past on several occasions. Culturally, that I think is where the barrier is, because the IC is used in a certain way by decision makers, and being prescriptive kind of cuts into what I think decision makers see as their roles, or planners and strategists and other people that are in different parts of the military or the civilian organizations. Do you have thoughts on that, on how do you actually step towards a prescriptive intelligence?
Well, I'll give a response to that question, and also on another issue. So I think in Russia and China, if the intelligence analyst is not providing prescriptive insight for decision makers, planners, or operators, they're regarded as not delivering their job, delivering on their job in a professional manner. So it's not just table stakes, it's really expected. Here we have that taboo, right? And I think it's okay for intelligence analysts to think about different courses of action and things that might be optimal in response to anticipated circumstances. Ultimately, the planner, the decision maker, the operator is going to make their own decision. But I don't think there's any real issue with putting those insights on the table, especially if they're informed by both cultural intelligence, general military intelligence, and S&TI. I think that that should be expected by our decision makers. The other comment that I'd make, and it's an area for us to explore more aggressively, the observation is that in both Russia and China, all intelligence, finished intelligence that is produced, is the result of a net assessment. It's all relative to the posture, position, disposition of your opponent. And so all intelligence analysis is a result of net assessment. And I think that Intel net assessment in the United States is at the very beginning of a bright future in much the same way that Andrew Marshall pioneered it within the Department of Defense. So I think that's vital. The last comment, and I think this might be one of the most valuable things I say today, is that we have very clearly understood the value of digital mission engineering and the application of these technologies for research, development, and acquisition. We have champions in that space. But if you shift it just a little bit and you suggest applying that in the context of the intelligence mission, you don't find that discussion happening. You don't find the champion for that to happen. And I think that that we need that. I think that like the acquisition community had Dr. Roper, the Intel community needs a champion and an advocate for this type of change. The incorporation of digital mission engineering and other intelligence, science, and technology for intelligence of arguably greater value and relevance.
Yeah, I agree completely, and would reinforce also what you said about intelligence net assessment. That's a really interesting thought, that for our adversaries, that's the baseline as they think about net assessment. And I know that Dan Flynn is listening. So so we have 10 minutes left. And I'd like to do an around the room question. And Tim Zimmerlin brings up, he says, today's focus has been on state actors in strategy. Today's threats are not states, but raise conflicts between states: climate, water, food, disease, migration. So I do think we sort of have a bias within the IC of thinking about national security as something that is state to state, or over the last 20 years, more and more thinking about it as state to non-state actor, but still some human group that has a strategy and a direction and considers itself an adversary, and we consider it an adversary. And now there are more and more issues that are general, like climate change, that are arguably equally, if not more destructive than interstate conflict ever was, and certainly more destructive than non-state actors have been. And COVID-19 is just the latest such example. And this has been noticed by others. And the HIPSI did a report and talked about, I think they used the phrase soft issues like this, and how the IC should focus on them. So what I'd like to do is go around and ask each of you, with that context, and taking yourself out of the sort of innate assumption of intelligence is about states and non-state actors, but might be also about other national security issues that have to do with not only non-state issues, not human issues, the sort of general changes in climate or pandemics and so forth. What would you say to that in terms of your discussion and thoughts from earlier today? And I leave it general like that in order to give you an opportunity to address the issue in whatever way you would like. And so I'll go around the room in the same order that we all spoke today. Jack?
Hey, briefly, I think the whole idea of nationalism is going to be challenged over the next 25 years. The more I think about this, the more I think about this idea of global instantaneous communications, where community of interests are now banding across the world. Just look at our own country and the divisions internal to the United States right now. It's threatening the idea of what is a state in the first place. So we had better be working on this analysis of all these other state issues and non-state issues. I think there's a real challenge coming in the future of why is China so interested in keeping the CCP as the driving force? Because they can't control it if it begins to come apart. So we have really got to be thinking differently, and it brings in all these other issues you mentioned, Anthony. It's climate change, it's pandemics. I think it's a matter of prioritization, as it always is when you're working sort of across the intelligence community. But having enough resources applied to these other problem sets that you might catch them before they happen. Now we're into the predictive and now prescriptive, as Jason was describing it. I think all speakers touched on this a little bit and said this in different ways. I think it's a matter of having to try to see much further in the future and put away some of our assumptions that you just said, Anthony, about state actors, that it's state on state conflict. It's not. It's state in some cases, it's non-state in some cases, and in other cases, it's community of interest that just happen to be equally upset about something happening around the world. So I think we got to put some brains together, thinking about what collection analysis looks like differently over the next 15 years.
Great. Yeah, good. Davey?
Yeah, I think that, Jack, on that very last point, what does collection analysis look like? There's a required anticipation that's baked into this, that we need to anticipate that the threats facing the nation today and the people today are going to be different than what we experienced yesterday or in the time past. Now, they are expected, they're going to be climate, there'll be pandemics, there'll be rising sea levels, which threaten highly populated littoral cities. We know broadly what those problems are, but we don't yet know how and in what way they will manifest. This anticipation means we need to be collecting not just with this state-on-state mentality, but whether it's through an open source agency or through an ongoing utilization of open materials in kind of the intelligence analysis, we need to be expecting that there are going to be signals, and then there's also going to be emergent behavior, and then also signals of emerging pandemics or crises that we need to respond to faster. From there, for anticipation, identification, decision, and response all need to be continual. But those signals that we're looking for, I agree, will not necessarily be a state either purchasing or creating new weapon systems, cyber capabilities, or AI. It might be an influx of refugees from arid zones that are no longer farmable. It could be large cities that are no longer able to support the population that they've grown, either due to water or food conditions. Those can easily spark off large conflicts. They can spark off migration. They can spark off humanitarian crises. And the intelligence community, we need to be turning our sights to be looking at these and to be anticipating them and to be responding to them. So I think that it shouldn't just, when thinking about the collection, you're almost going to always be looking for that black swan event. You're going to be looking for these tail risk elements, but that needs to be baked into part of the ongoing efforts from the intelligence community. And there needs to be the infrastructure, not only to recognize those, but to also coordinate a whole of government response, should that be required, more effectively. I think in particular, COVID has caught many of us thinking about the next pandemic, but the next crisis may look similar or may be something completely different. But we need to be anticipatory across all possibilities going forward. Thank you.
Great. Duyane?
Yeah, I agree with Jack and Davey. I joined the agency in the early 90s when we were really trying to figure out what our mission was after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And we made a significant pivot to non-nation state actors. This is really an extension of that. I think, if you're not evolving and changing with times, then you're going to become irrelevant. And I think it's clear that some of the great challenges that we face don't have to do necessarily with states. I'm going to take for my little piece of this answer, I'm going to take a page out of Todd's book, though, and talk specifically about my area of expertise. And so if we're talking about humans, for some of these challenges, there's not necessarily a human in the loop. If you're trying to assess how high the seas are going to rise over the next 20 years, maybe, that's more of a math question than a human question. But for most of these, there are humans in that loop, including a couple that Davey talked about that might spark wars. It may not be a nation. It may be why are a certain collection of people moving, what would prompt them to move, what conditions would prompt them to move, what might motivate them to stay put, or how could you make their lives better so that they wouldn't cause these migratory problems for other entities. But when there is a human in the loop, and particularly when there is an potentially adversarial human in the loop, somebody whose values don't necessarily, or interests don't necessarily align with ours, I think you have to be in a position to be able to understand and predict their behavior, which oftentimes is going to be irrational or unpredictable. And that piece of intelligence is critical. And so I think all of this technology can solve a lot of these, but some of these questions are not purely math questions. They are very human questions that are informed and made, where decisions and judgments are made better by math and science placed on top of that.
Todd?
All right, I'll step out of my area of expertise. I think that really what I was thinking as you asked the question, Duyane already hit on part of it. I don't think that these environmental or natural threats are going to do away with our need to continue to do the state-focused collection and analysis. I think what it's going to mean is that this is going to become a really wicked problem, because we're going to have to do the environmental collection. We're going to have to, rely on that more scientific, maybe NOAA now is, a vital part of the intelligence community collecting this data for climate change and environmental issues. We're going to have to collect on these individual communities that are going to be affected by these disasters. Right. And so instead of collecting on these small communities that are dispersed, something we, do again from time to time, right? But may have to do it on a much wider basis. And then I think we're still going to have to worry about states that are going to take advantage of this situation to try to gain something. So, I could see, forcing, refugees into certain areas so that they can then somehow gain an advantage. I could see, military or police forces being put in a very awkward or difficult position of how do you handle these, groups of refugees coming across the border into your country when you already don't have enough resources, perhaps to protect and care for your own citizens.
I like that. NOAA is the 19th member of the intelligence community. Jason, bring us home.
Well, I would associate myself with all of the comments that have been made by the previous speakers with this question. I would just fall back onto what I said earlier. I think that the framework and the construct for the way that we think about intelligence and the targets of intelligence needs to fundamentally change. We're talking about different spheres. We're talking about biology, we're talking about matter, we're talking about knowledge, we're talking about things in the virtual space, we're talking about things in the cognitive space. So that construct needs to change and evolve a bit. So in addition to the worlds and the spheres that should prompt that, I also think that we need to be that panopticon, right? We need to be that system that is constantly watching and understanding not only what's happening in the present, but really does strive to get out into the predictive and the prescriptive spaces. And I have felt probably since about 2001, that we'd thrown in the towel on that a bit, with the disestablishment of the NIO for warning, et cetera. I think we need to recover that, and we need to broaden the focus of that function in a very specific way, not relying upon other parts or segments of different intel organizations to just capture it on their own. I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Look, thank you, everybody. Fascinating discussion. It was a privilege to be a part of it today. Thank you all for joining, and thank you to everyone in the audience. And Joe, I turn it over to you.
Well, let me add my thanks to our speakers, to Anthony, and to our audience for a very interesting colloquium today. So we'll call the meeting adjourned, and we'll see you on August 25th. Thank you all.